Hi everyone and welcome to our first Flipped Collab for our unit Educational Leadership Management and Program Assessment. My name's Rachel Couchy. If you haven't met me before, I am your unit coordinator as well as ELA for some of you. Welcome to the presentation. Now, if you head over to the assessment details, you'll notice that we have an essay. It is 2,000 words. It is worth 50% of your mark, as we only have the two assessments throughout this particular unit, which can be a good thing because it gives you some time to work on each of them and spend a little bit more time, a little bit more depth, and a little bit more word count spread between the two rather than the three. It is due in week 7, as I said, and that is Monday the 26th of April at 5 p.m. So week 7 can be a little bit problematic after consolidation week. So essentially, I suppose we've got 6 weeks to prepare and have your ELAs available to you to ask and answer questions. So the way I like to design my Flipped Collabs, if you haven't seen any of them before, is that I'll spend the next half an hour or so just going over some of the really main important things that I've taken out of the assessment details that I thought you should need to know straight away. Now, obviously, being a 50% weighted 2,000 word essay, we can't talk about everything in this particular presentation, but it's just supposed to be enough to get you started so that when you come to the interactive collab or when you listen back to the recording of that one, you've already got certain knowledge that you can use to say, hey, you asked that in the Flip Collab and then I've come here to get some clarification. So take notes. Hopefully it's enough to get you started nice and early in the unit so that when you do come to our interactive collab, you've got lots of questions for us. If you're wondering about collabs, I've put the dates in the Padlet, but I've tried to push them nice and early because we got some feedback last time that week 4 and week 8 were a little bit too late. So I've pushed them into week 3 and week 7. So they will be our interactive collabs on the Tuesday, but they're always recorded if you're not available. Let's get started. So if you had a look at the assessment details, you'll notice that obviously it's an essay and it's all based around one particular quote or one particular theme. So with the quote, because it's sort of an underlying theme of the whole essay, we have to keep sort of making this sort of circular motion back to it. So even though we're talking about models, we're talking about theories, we're talking about early childhood, we're not just talking about them generally. We have this particular quote that we're always kind of linking back to. So all of our key ideas focus on this rod quote, which has come from our readings for this week. So it says that where understanding leadership in early childhood has been plagued by its confusion with the concept of management. So that's the idea that we're always coming back to. Don't just tell us about leadership theory in general. Don't just say this is trait theory and this is behavioral theory as a general explanation. We're always linking back to obviously early childhood settings because that's the basis of the unit we're in, but we're also linking back to why is there confusion? This is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. Like I said, I've just pulled out things that I thought would be useful for you to get started. So these were things that I thought could be areas to perhaps be further explored. So why is it that sometimes management and leadership, it's not this clear definition between the two? Well, obviously there's going to be a lot of certain qualities. You've probably noticed as you've been on the DB this week in week 1, that a lot of the qualities that we embrace in leadership are also qualities that we embrace in a manager. So perhaps the ideals or the dispositions that we're going to have a look at can be found in each person. So perhaps that's an area of confusion. I've got a few here that I want to talk you through. So with early childhood, there could be a lack of agreement on language. So, reading through a lot of assessments when the unit last ran, a lot of students were really successful in arguing this point. So, they were able to say that in a lot of the documentation, within particular childcare centres or within particular kinders and different early childhood settings, the terms in the documentation were often just used interchangeably, and there was no real definition or no real distinction between the two in any particular documents. Now, obviously, you need to support what you're saying in terms of your people's practices and places. So then you use something like quality area, I think it's quality area number 5, where they talk about sort of lumping this together in one sort of policy or one sort of documentation or one quality area where we've lumped them together. So some students were saying last time that perhaps this was causing some confusion, because in some areas it was called leadership, in some areas it was called management, in some areas it was called leadership and management, and it was sort of always just sort of lumped together interchangeably without that real distinction. That could be an area worth investigating further. Something that came up in the readings for me last time, which I thought was really interesting, is the fact that there's very little research, really good quality research into early childhood settings, which kind of made me cross. So thinking about a lot of educational research, and I come from a primary background, so I understand. Maybe I didn't understand fully this until I really had a look into it. But a lot of the educational research does tend to be very primary focused and very perhaps even secondary focused. So is there really good quality research into how leaders and managers look in early childhood, and have these leaders been investigated and researched, and is there good quality data and academic research about this? And we tended to find that there was a lack. It did tend to focus more on primary and other sort of educational settings. One thing that is very interesting about early childhood generally is that it's quite a vast educational landscape. And what I meant by that was, school is generally school. Now, obviously, we have Catholic schools and we have independent schools and we have state schools and we have variations between states and whatnot. But generally, schools tend to run the same way. They tend to have the same sort of leadership hierarchy, tend to have the same sort of models. Obviously, educational research behind it is all sort of come from the same avenues. So there's a lot of consistencies within school. There's a lot of consistencies within the leadership within schools, and leadership in schools is very highly defined. So we have, principal class, and we have learning support and learning specialists, there's different rungs almost of leadership. It can be different in early childhood, where you've got, there's not only variations from, long day care to kinder to different centres, but, one centre can be different from the other. That's the thing that I just found amazing, was that, we can say kinders are different to long day care, but it's also different between particular settings. Also can cause confusion. So perhaps this vast landscape between, privatisation of particular early childhood settings, council-run settings, are you in a rural community, are you in the city? There's just so many different, this vast landscape of early childhood really would perhaps make a difference to how leadership and management is structured within particular centres. A lot of students explored the sort of limited opportunities for leadership, and they sort of went into these sort of next 3. I wouldn't lump them together, but they are sort of, I suppose, within the same vein of there being limited opportunities for leadership, or perhaps people were pushed into leadership when they weren't ready. because they might have been tapped on the shoulder, but were they really given the insight and given the training into leadership that was needed perhaps to be an effective leader, rather than just assuming that people know. There's limited leadership opportunities. And again, just using the primary as a bit of a contrasting example, within a primary setting, you've got particular leadership forums and leadership functions and Barstow and all of these things that you can do to become a leader. Are they available for early childhood sector, and which they obviously should be? Is there a gender divide, or perhaps some sort of gender, not so much gender gap maybe is not the right word, perhaps gender bias, or the fact that early childhood, there was something in the readings that I thought was just amazing, that, we're not just nice people with who like kids. There should be value in making sure that early childhood teachers get the same opportunity as other educational sectors, but also get the same opportunities as, it shouldn't be any different from the corporate sector or financial sector or any other sector. There should still be leadership nurturing and leadership opportunities together with that as well. Sometimes there's resistance from teachers if a model doesn't fit their unique circumstance, which kind of lends itself back to the vast landscape. So understanding the roles of leaders and management. So like I said, we do need to define leadership and we need to define management. So please put that in big red letters at the top of your Word document when you're drafting. You do need to define, but the issue that we had last time with a few students is, like I said in the very beginning, they didn't define it in the context of the quote or in the context of early childhood. We're not just talking, it's not simply an essay that requires you to define leadership and explain what it is. So you kind of got to show that you understand leadership through early childhood people, places, and practices. So discuss and analyse the roles of leaders and management in an educational setting. So always keep your EC focus. Always think about it in terms of early childhood. Analyse the required skills and dispositions. So we're talking about a disposition being an inherent quality, whereas a skill is something you're able to do. So being, kind and approachable, and what other ones have we got there? Risk-taking, visionary, we could probably say are dispositions, because there's something inherent within you. It's a quality. Being caring, being kind, being empathetic, all dispositions, something inherent about your nature within you. And a skill is something that you're able to do well. So things there like, being organised, communicating, telling people what to do, organising tasks, are the skills. So we want to sort of define it in terms of still keeping our early childhood focus, but defining it in terms of disposition and defining it in terms of skills. Now, when I do the interactive collab with you, I'll talk about how you weave this into the quote and how you weave it into an early childhood focus. So we'll give you a little bit more guidance. But for now, what you can do is just break down some of the different leadership styles and approaches. Now, I know that can seem terribly overwhelming, because some students said to me last time, oh, this unit, there's too much theory. I don't know all the leadership theories. And my response to them was, you don't need to know them all off the top of your head, and don't even try or even go there. You don't need to learn everything and know it all. We're not going to test you and say, well, what's trait theory? And you just need to know. I don't even remember them all. What we'll use them for is we'll use them to support our ideas within the quote and within our practice. So don't feel overwhelmed. Don't feel like you got to memorize them all. Don't feel like you got to know them all. What is more important is that we can look at something like so perhaps gender equality or lack of research in the early childhood sector, and then perhaps connect it to some of the theories we've been learning about, and maybe give some explanation as to why that might be occurring, and linking it back to this idea of the confusion and linking it back to the people, places, and practices. So don't feel overwhelmed, don't feel like you have to learn it all, but do start having a look at what potentially the confusion could be coming from, and maybe some leadership styles and management ideas that lend itself well to that. Even if just for now you start defining what it is generally, you can always weave that into your discussion once you have a little bit more insight after week 3. So number 3 is understand models and theories of leadership and management. So we've sort of touched on this a little bit with the previous slide, but some people needed a little bit more definition, I suppose, last time, to make sure that you've got theories and models. So that's very important. So you don't want to get marked down within the rubric because you've just got 2 theories. Make sure you've got models as well. So within the next few weeks of readings, you'll notice that you're going to be introduced to all of these types of theory. Like, theory is quite self-explanatory. We all know that there's a theory to do with leadership, but then there's also these particular models as well. So you're going to connect some of the ideas about the confusion and people, practice, and places within the essay back to either Collins, Maxwell, and then all up until this more like Moyles and the most recent one. Now, Collins was the first one, as you can see in 1991 was the first model. It was Vander, and then a lot of them built on from that. So the models are not entirely new or different from each other. It was like, say Collins put some ideas out there, and then say Katz expanded on it or added to it. So a lot of the models are quite similar. Each theorist is sort of based on each other, and they've just added or changed different things to improve the model. So we need to make sure that we've got theories and models. And again, in the interactive collab, I'll give you some examples of some previous students' works and how they've managed to not just define the model and not just define the theory, but they've used it as a support to talk about why there is confusion and link to EC practice. Understanding theory in a practical setting is number 4. Now, it's really important that we don't just have a generic response to theory and models. Like I said in the previous slide, everything needs to be connected back to early childhood, and everything needs to be connected back to the quote. You guys are amazing, and majority of you have been working in early childhood for quite some time, and even if you haven't, you have the experience. Trust your own self, trust your own judgment, and use it. Sit down and just think about your own life experience and think about the things that have happened to you. If we look back at the quote and we say to ourselves, Rod is telling us that there is confusion in early childhood between, she says it's plagued with confusion between understanding leadership and the concept of management. Can you think about a time in your own practice, in your own workplace, where you have seen this exact thing happen? Perhaps there was some documentation where you saw leadership and management being used interchangeably. Perhaps you saw leaders that were pushed into the role without any training. Or perhaps you saw, say, leaders who were unsupported or not given, or perhaps in this degree you've seen that there hasn't been much touched on in terms of early childhood academic theory even. So think about your own practice and how it can relate. People who did this last time had really strong examples because they felt it, they reflected on things that had happened to them or they'd seen or heard or experienced in their own real life. Now, obviously, we don't want to talk in first person or give stories. We're just thinking of our own experience and how we can connect that back to the quote. So obviously with people, we're talking about all sorts of ranges of people. It doesn't mean that you have to connect to every single kind of person that could be in an early childhood setting. It just means that we're going to connect back to something practical. And that's a good way of looking at it. And that's a way we'll look at it when we do our interactive collab. We're going to look at leadership in a practical sense. So how does it apply to real life? That's your $1 million question. So you could relate to people such as stakeholders or parents or children. How does it apply to children? Essentially, we are there for the kids. We are there to improve the experience for them. We are there to improve their well-being. We are there to take care of them. We are there to educate them. So has there been some confusion between leadership and management that you've seen that's impacted negatively on the children's experience? Have you seen confusion between leadership and management at certain places? Maybe that connects back to the vast landscape and how different centres can be different. And perhaps sessional teachers who go from one centre to another have no idea because every place has their own policies about leadership and how it's to be implemented. Practices is the how, is the pedagogy, is the how it actually works. So again, there could be different documentation between different centres. Who's overseeing this? What's the governing body? Like I said, with schools being a different sort of have different sort of setup, because even though we do have different sectors, all schools sort of run in the same way and have the same sort of, obviously we use the same curriculum and we have the same pedagogical approaches that have been pushed out from different academics, and we sort of operate the same way. So how is that impacting on early childhood? You don't have to have an example for people, you don't have to have an example for places, and you don't have to have an example for practices for each of the areas of confusion you're going to talk about. So it's just a general way of saying, how can we take the idea of the quote, link it to theory, and then link it to practice? And again, we'll talk about this. I'll give you some examples of what students did last time in our interactive collab. All right, number 5 is writing an essay. This is an essay. It has to be structured in a way that it makes sense. So I've just written up here that I'll add a clearer version to the Padlet, just because obviously this one's a little bit small. We don't want to strain our eyes. So it's really important that you have your introduction that makes sense and highlights the main contentions of the essay. You have your conclusion, and then as you can see with the teal, you'll have your couple of paragraphs. So for example, you'll have your key concept related to the quote. For example, early childhood has a vast educational landscape is paragraph 1. Paragraph 2 is the lack of training and the high turnover of staff. Paragraph 3 is lack of early childhood research in academic areas. And paragraph 4 is something else. So you're going to go through each of the areas of confusion and weave your discussion of theories and models and people, practices and places within that. Again, this is a bit of an overview. There is still a lot to talk about, but I hope it's been enough to get you started and get you thinking. The first thing that you need to do is start thinking about what these areas of confusion are going to be for you, and start having a look at how you can define leadership and management. They're probably good starting points. So I'll see you in the interactive collab next week, which is Tuesday night of week 3. The dates are in the Padlet. Have a good night.